The night Hazel drove alone to the hospital with her son turning blue in the back seat, her husband's phone rang 11 times. 11. She counted later. She had nothing else to do in the waiting room except sit in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights that hummed like something dying, and count the number of times she had called a man who was 40 minutes away in a hotel room on the other side of the city, choosing not to answer. Hazel Oren was 31 years old when her life split in two, the before and the after. Before was ordinary in the way most marriages are ordinary. School lunches packed the night before, Sunday grocery runs at the Leblancs on Wellington, the small agreements and small resentments that pile up quietly over years without either person noticing the weight. She and her husband Marcus. No, not Marcus. She always caught herself wanting to call him something softer than what he was. His name was Fletcher. Fletcher Oren. And for 6 years she had believed he was someone worth the name she shared with him. They had met at a work conference in Ottawa. She was there representing the healthcare nonprofit she managed grants for. He was presenting on urban development contracts. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying, or at least that was what she thought at the time. Later she would understand that it wasn't warmth he radiated. It was performance. But she was 24 and she confused the two, and by the time she figured out the difference, they had a 4-year-old son named Elliot and a semi-detached in Westdale, Hamilton, and a mortgage that had both their names on it. Elliot was the best thing that had ever happened to Hazel. That is not something she says lightly, or the way parents sometimes say it as filler between other sentences. She means it structurally, the way you mean it when something reorganizes you from the inside and you cannot remember exactly who you were before. Elliot had her coloring, her mother's eyes, and an imagination so extravagant that he once spent an entire afternoon explaining to Hazel the political system of a civilization he had invented that lived inside the heating vents. He was allergic to tree nuts. Severely. The kind of allergy that required an EpiPen in his backpack, one in the kitchen drawer, and a laminated emergency card in his lunch bag that Hazel updated every September. Fletcher knew this. He had been there when the allergist explained it the first time. He had nodded. He had signed the forms. But that is getting ahead of things. The December Elliot turned 4 was the first winter. Hazel noticed something was wrong. Not wrong in any way she could name, not at first. More like a frequency she couldn't quite hear but felt in her back teeth. Fletcher started working late more often. Not every night, but often enough that it became the new shape of their evenings. Hazel putting Elliot to bed alone, heating up dinner alone, watching something on the laptop alone, before Fletcher came home smelling of a long day in the cold. He was distracted in a way that looked like stress, and she believed him when he said it was the Brampton contract, because she wanted to believe him. Because it was easier. Because Elliot was 4 and she was managing a demanding job and a household, and she did not have the bandwidth to investigate a feeling. She would hate herself for that later. She spent a long time hating herself for that. The signs were there, of course. They always are. His phone going face down on the counter the moment he walked in. The slight delay before answering simple questions. Where were you? How was the meeting? Do you want pasta or rice? The kind of pause that doesn't mean anything on its own but accumulates meaning over months like snow. He stopped initiating any kind of conversation about the future. He stopped asking about her day with the particular curiosity of someone who actually wants to know. He was present in the physical sense. Sitting across from her at dinner, sleeping beside her at night. But there was a quality of elsewhere about him that she told herself was just the Brampton contract. It was not the Brampton contract. Her name was Renata. Hazel didn't know that yet. She would find out the way she found out everything. Too late and all at once. Elliot's 4th birthday was in February. Hazel's mother, Sylvie, drove up from Dundas to help with the party. 8 4-year-olds in the living room. A cake shaped like a train that took Hazel 2 evenings to get right. Crepe paper streamers in Elliot's favorite color, which was currently orange. Fletcher came home in time to sing happy birthday and take photos and play the role of present father, and he did it well. He had always been good at showing up for the visible things. Sylvie had watched him that afternoon with a stillness Hazel recognized. Her mother was a woman who kept her observations very close to her chest until the moment she decided they were necessary. She had been a high school vice principal for 22 years. She knew how to watch people. After the children had gone home and Elliot had been put to bed in a state of total exhaustion, and Fletcher had disappeared upstairs saying he had to take a call, Sylvie sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Something isn't right with that man." Hazel had said, "He's just under a lot of pressure." Sylvie had said nothing. She just looked at Hazel the way she sometimes looked at things she was deciding whether to say. She didn't say it that night, she was not wrong to wait. Some truths need a little more time before they can be received. The night everything broke open was a Thursday in late November. Elliot had just started junior kindergarten, and he'd come home that day with a project on hibernating animals and a slight wheeze that Hazel attributed to the dry air in his classroom. She gave him his puffer after dinner, read him 2 chapters of his current favorite book about a raccoon detective, and got him settled. Fletcher had texted around 6 to say he'd be late. A site meeting that ran over. Could she not wait up? She didn't wait up. She went to sleep at 10:30 with her phone plugged in on the nightstand. At 2:17 a.m., she woke to the sound of Elliot coughing. It was not a normal cough. Every parent knows the difference between a routine cough and the cough that brings you out of sleep with your heart already pounding before you're fully conscious. Hazel was in his room in seconds. He was sitting up in bed, and in the light from his nightlight she could see his face. The way his lips looked, the effort his small chest was making to breathe. She said his name. He looked at her. She said, "Show me your hands, sweetheart. Do your hands feel tingly?" He nodded. She was already moving. She grabbed the EpiPen from the kitchen drawer, administered it the way she had practiced, the way the allergist had walked her through so many times that her hands did not shake. But even with the EpiPen, with a reaction this severe, you still go to the hospital immediately. That is not a question. She wrapped Elliot in his blanket, carried him to the car, buckled him into his car seat. He was breathing, but it was not good breathing. She called Fletcher from the driveway. No answer. She pulled out of the driveway and called again. No answer. She drove. She called 3 more times before she got to the end of their street. She called twice more at the red light on Aberdeen. By the time she was on the highway she had stopped counting. The McMaster Children's Emergency was 12 minutes from their house. Hazel made it in 9. What followed was the kind of time that does not move in a normal way. There were nurses, and a small boy who was struggling, and rooms she was not allowed into, and a waiting area with plastic chairs, and a television mounted in the corner playing a home renovation show with the sound off. Someone brought her a cup of water at some point. She held it without drinking it. She tried Fletcher 4 more times. The phone rang and rang. She called her mother. Sylvie answered on the second ring, because Sylvie always answered on the second ring, at any hour. Because she had always understood that a call at 3 a.m. from her daughter meant something was wrong. And the most important thing she could do was answer. Within 35 minutes, Sylvie was in the waiting room beside her. She had driven from Dundas in the middle of the night without asking whether it was necessary, without making Hazel explain and justify and contextualize. She just came. Hazel's father, Bernard, arrived 11 minutes after Sylvie. He was 68 years old, a retired civil engineer, a man of very few words and very reliable actions. He sat down on Hazel's other side, put his large hand over hers and said, "We're here." That was all he said. It was exactly enough. They sat together through the next hour. The doctor came out at 4:44 a.m. Hazel knew from the way she walked. She knew before any words were spoken. A doctor who is walking toward you with good news walks differently than a doctor who is walking toward you with the other thing. It is a small difference, but it is unmistakable, and Hazel saw it from across the room, and she felt her mother's hand grip her arm. They had done everything they could. The reaction had been catastrophic. Elliot's airway had closed. They had not been able to bring him back. Elliot was 4 years old and 7 months. He liked raccoon detectives and the color orange and the heating vents in their house where an entire civilization lived. And he was gone. Fletcher arrived at the hospital at 6:10 a.m. He walked in looking like a man who had been asleep, slightly disheveled, his jacket on wrong, a quality of haste about him that he had mistimed. He saw Hazel's face and he stopped walking. Hazel looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Where were you?" He started to say something about his phone being on silent, about the battery dying, about the meeting that had run late and he'd fallen asleep at the office. He had a whole architecture of explanation built and ready. She could hear it assembling itself in real time. Her father stood up. Bernard was not a large man in the way that announces itself. He was average height, solid, quiet. But he stood up and he turned to look at Fletcher, and there was something in that look that stopped Fletcher mid-sentence. Bernard said, "My grandson is gone." Fletcher said, I know, I'm so sorry." Bernard said, "Your son is gone and you didn't answer the phone." Fletcher said, "My battery, 11 calls." Hazel said. Her voice was very flat. It had gone somewhere she didn't recognize. "I called you 11 times. Fletcher looked at her. He did not have anything to say to that. "Fletcher," she said, "where were you?" It was not a question this time. Not really, and perhaps it was the flatness of her voice, or the presence of her parents on either side of her, or some calculation in him that recognized the moment had shifted past the point where any story would hold. but something in him collapsed, and he said, "I was at the Marriott. Downtown." Hazel said nothing. It wasn't. Bernard said quietly, "I think you should go." Fletcher looked at him. "You should go," Bernard said again. Now, Fletcher went. The next weeks were not something Hazel could describe in any linear way. Grief at that scale does not move in a line. It moved in her the way weather moves. Suddenly, from directions she didn't expect, in intensities that had no relationship to whatever she was doing at the time. She could be fine, or something like fine, making tea, or responding to an email. And then she would pass Elliot's room, and the Raccoon Detective book would be on the floor exactly where she'd left it out. And she would have to sit down on the hallway floor and stay there for a while. She went to stay with her parents. She could not be in the house. Bernard and Sylvie made up her childhood bedroom and did not ask her to talk about anything she didn't want to talk about. They fed her. They sat with her. Sylvie's older sister, her Aunt Régiane, drove in from Sudbury and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and was just there, which is sometimes the only thing you can offer and also the best thing. Hazel did not speak to Fletcher. She had her lawyer send the initial paperwork within 10 days. She was thorough about it. Meanwhile, Bernard was not idle. This is the part that people don't fully understand about Hazel's father. He was quiet. He was not a man who raised his voice or made speeches. He expressed love through practical action. Through showing up at 3 a.m., through sitting beside you in a plastic chair, through making sure things that needed to be done got done. And he had decided, with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, that what needed to be done now was to make sure that what had happened in that hospital was fully understood by everyone who needed to understand it. Bernard had spent 22 years in public sector contracting. He knew lawyers. He knew inspectors. He knew how systems worked and where the pressure points were. And what he knew, specifically, was that Fletcher Oren held a license, issued by the province, to operate as a certified project manager on publicly funded construction contracts. A designation that came with a professional conduct code that extended, in cases of gross negligence, beyond the workplace. He made some calls. Hazel did not know the full extent of what her father was doing. She learned pieces of it over time, the way you learn things you weren't present for. Gradually, through accounts from people who were there, through documents that arrived with her name on them, through the eventual reconstruction of events that had unfolded, while she was sitting on her parents' living room couch, not eating what she knows. Bernard reached out to a lawyer he had worked with on municipal contracts, a woman named Dorothea Ames, who had a reputation for being exceptionally thorough and not remotely interested in being liked by the people on the opposing side. Dorothea had reviewed the details of that night and determined that Fletcher's failure to respond, knowingly leaving his phone unanswered for an extended period while his son was in medical distress, constituted a form of parental negligence that warranted both civil and professional scrutiny. The civil filing named Fletcher in a wrongful death suit. It was not a guaranteed outcome. These cases rarely are. But the documentation of his whereabouts that night, which came out through standard discovery, through hotel records, through the phone of the woman he had been with, whose name Hazel eventually learned, was not something she chose to spend her energy on. Made a very complete picture of a man who had been exactly where he'd chosen to be, doing exactly what he'd chosen to do, while his son died. The professional conduct complaint was filed simultaneously with the provincial licensing body. Fletcher's employer was notified. The project he was leading on the Brampton contract was reviewed. 3 discrepancies in materials reporting were discovered. Bernard had not planted those discrepancies. He had simply created the conditions under which they would be found. Fletcher was suspended from the contract pending review. He was referred for a full audit of his previous projects. He retained a lawyer. His lawyer was not Dorothea Ames. Hazel did not attend most of the proceedings. She attended what she had to attend and left the rest to her father and to Dorothea, who she came to trust completely in the particular way. You trust someone who does not perform competence, but simply demonstrates it at every turn. She went back to work in January, 4 weeks after Elliot died, not because she was ready, because she needed something to do with her hands, something that required her to be a person who showed up and solved problems and drank coffee at a desk. She told her manager what had happened. Her manager was a woman named Philippa, who had 3 children of her own and said only, "Take whatever you need, and when you're ready, we want you here." That was the right thing to say. Hazel was grateful for it. She still drove past the turnoff toward the Marriott sometimes, on her way to other places, and she still felt something in her chest when she did. Not just grief, something harder. But she did not dwell on it. She was learning what to do with the things she couldn't change, and what to do instead was move and keep moving. and put one foot in front of the other in the direction of a life that was still worth something. It was harder than it sounds. It was also the only option she had. The civil settlement was reached in spring. Fletcher's insurance covered part of it. The rest came from his personal assets, which, combined with the suspension of income from the Brampton project, left him in a significantly reduced position from the one he had occupied 6 months earlier. Hazel did not take satisfaction in this exactly. It was not satisfaction she was after. She had wanted accountability, which is a different thing. Quieter, less dramatic, but more sustaining. Accountability means the record reflects what actually happened. It means Elliot's life and death were not private matters that could be managed into invisibility. They were real, and they had real consequences. The licensing board ultimately issued a formal censure and mandatory professional supervision for Fletcher's future contracts. He was not permanently barred. Hazel did not know whether she wished he had been. She had spent a long time thinking about what she wanted from the process, and what she had arrived at was this. She wanted him to have to tell the truth. To the board, to his colleagues, to anyone who asked why his record showed what it showed. She wanted the version of events in which he was simply a hard-working man, who had suffered a personal tragedy to be unavailable to him. She wanted the actual version. The one where he chose to be unreachable while his son was dying. To be the version on file. That is what she got. The woman he had been with. Hazel did not follow what happened to her and did not try to. She made a decision, early on, that spending her energy on that person was a way of giving that person significance she did not deserve. She heard through the divorce proceedings that the relationship had ended shortly after everything became public. She was not surprised. The kind of person who participates in what Fletcher had been doing is rarely the kind of person who stays when the circumstances stop being convenient. Hazel had no feelings about this either way. Or rather, she had a feeling, and the feeling was, it doesn't matter. What mattered was smaller and closer. It was her parents' kitchen table. It was Ray's voice on the phone on Tuesday evenings, checking in without making a production of it. It was going back to the Loblaws on Wellington for the first time since everything. And walking through the whole store slowly, buying things she would actually cook, paying and leaving, and sitting in the car afterward for 10 minutes, because sometimes you need 10 minutes, and then driving home and cooking them. It was Sylvie coming to stay for a week in March and repainting Hazel's kitchen with her. Because Hazel had said, once offhandedly, that she had always wanted it to be a different color, and Sylvie had appeared the following weekend with paint samples and a roller, and her good shoes changed for work clothes. It was small, it was also everything. Bernard was not someone who accepted being thanked gracefully. When Hazel tried to thank him, in the spring, for what he had done, for all the calls made, the meetings attended, the quiet and effective dismantling of the story Fletcher had been trying to tell about himself. Bernard had looked at her with an expression she recognized from childhood, the one that meant he was about to say something that he considered to be simply obvious. He said, "You are my daughter. Elliot was my grandson. A person who has done what that man has done does not get to walk away undisturbed. That's not something I needed to think about." Hazel had looked at her father for a long moment. 68 years old, retired, the man who had driven to McMaster Children's Hospital at 3 a.m. and sat beside her in a plastic chair and said, "We're here," because that was what there was to say. "Dad," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. She didn't. She just sat with him at the table, and they drank their coffee, and the kitchen was a different color now, and outside it was April in Hamilton, and the ice on the bay was breaking up, and eventually they were going to have to talk about what came next for both of them. But not yet. For now they just sat, and it was enough. There is something Hazel thinks about sometimes, late at night, in the particular hours when sleep doesn't come easily, and the mind goes where it wants to go. She thinks about those 11 calls. She thinks about what it would have taken for Fletcher to answer just one of them. To look down at his phone, to see her name, to have a flicker of something that made him pick it up. She does not know what went through his mind in those moments. She has stopped trying to figure it out. Some people are simply not who you thought they were, and the reasons for that are less interesting than you might imagine. What she comes back to is not him, it's Elliot. The raccoon detective book, the orange streamers from the birthday party, which she had carefully folded and kept in a box in her closet, because she couldn't throw them away. The heating vents, and the civilization inside them, the particular sound of him laughing. A full-body laugh, the kind 4-year-olds produce without self-consciousness, the kind that fills a room and then keeps bouncing around in your memory for years afterward, in the mornings, in grocery stores, at unexpected moments on otherwise ordinary days. He was here. That is a thing that is permanently true. He was here, and he was loved completely, and his life was real, and no proceeding or settlement or formal censure changes any of that, but neither does any of it take it away. The people who loved him know what they know. That has to be something. Hazel has decided that it is. She gets up in the morning. She makes coffee. She goes to work and manages her grants and talks to her colleagues and sometimes even laughs. Which surprised her the first time it happened, and then surprised her less. And now does not surprise her at all, because she understands that laughter is not disloyalty, it is just what the living do. She calls her mother on Thursday evenings. Her father comes for dinner on Sundays and fixes things around her apartment that don't strictly need fixing, because that is how he shows up. And she has stopped telling him not to bother. She is 32 years old and she is still here, and she does not take that lightly. Neither in the end does anyone who loves her.